She had everything money could build and nothing it could fix. Vivian Ashford, 30 years old, worth 9 figures, the kind of woman who walked into boardrooms and made men twice her age nervous, stood alone in a private garage staring at a car she hadn't touched in 8 years. The 1961 Jaguar E-Type sat under a gray cloth like something buried but not yet mourned. 27 experts, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Every single one of them had looked her in the eye and said the same word. Impossible. But one man hadn't said it yet. If you've ever held on to something long after everyone told you to let go, stay with me. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere. You'll want to see how this ends. The garage smelled like motor oil and old leather, and something else Vivian couldn't name. Something that lived in the back of the throat and didn't leave. She stood just inside the entrance with her arms crossed, not because she was cold, but because it was the posture she defaulted to when she was trying not to feel something. Her assistant, Derek, hovered near the door with a clipboard he never seemed to actually use. "He's 15 minutes out," Derek said. "Should I push the meeting to—" "No." She didn't turn around. "Just wait outside." Derek hesitated, probably calculating whether this was worth an argument. It wasn't. He knew that. He left without another word and pulled the side door shut behind him. And suddenly Vivian was alone in a space that held more of her father than any room in the house she'd grown up in. She walked toward the car slowly. Her heels made small, deliberate sounds on the poured concrete floor. The Jaguar sat against the far wall, covered with a gray-fitted cloth that had been placed over it so many times by so many different hands that it had started to take on the car's exact shape. Every curve of the hood, the long tapering tail, the flared wheel arches. Under that cloth, the car looked almost like it was sleeping. Vivian stopped a foot away from it and didn't reach out. She'd learned not to do that anymore. The first time she'd uncovered it after her father died, she'd sat on the concrete floor beside it for 2 hours and cried until she couldn't produce tears. The second time, she'd called the first restoration company on a list her father's attorney had prepared. By the 6th or 7th company, she'd stopped letting herself cry in here at all. Grief had a way of calcifying into something more useful when you gave it enough years and enough disappointments. She checked her watch. 11:43. The mechanic, his name was Ethan Cole, she'd checked, was due at noon. Her assistant had found him through a chain of referrals so convoluted it barely made sense. A friend of a guy who'd once worked at a restoration shop in Connecticut and remembered a name from almost a decade ago. Ethan Cole. Someone had said he was the best they'd ever seen with vintage British engines. Someone else had said he'd walked away from all of it years ago. Vivian had almost said no. She'd said no, actually, twice. Derek had brought it back up both times, which wasn't like him, which was the only reason she'd finally agreed. One more, fine, one more. She heard the truck before she saw it. A low, reliable engine sound, nothing dramatic. The kind of vehicle that had earned its mileage honestly. She moved to the side window and looked out. A white pickup, maybe 12 years old, with a toolbox bolted in the bed and a small dent in the rear driver's side panel. It pulled into the gravel lot and parked cleanly, no wasted movements. The man who got out was not what she'd been expecting. She didn't know exactly what she had been expecting. The other 27 experts had arrived in different configurations, some in suits, some in branded shop jackets, some with teams and equipment trailers and digital diagnostic systems that cost more than most people's cars. One had arrived by car service. Another had brought a documentary crew, which she'd turned away at the gate without discussion. Ethan Cole arrived alone in a white pickup truck wearing jeans and a canvas work shirt with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He was tall but not imposing, dark hair that needed a cut. He reached into the truck cab and pulled out a toolbox. Not a rolling case, an actual toolbox with a handle, the kind that looked like it had been kicked around for 10 years and kept working anyway. He set it on the gravel and looked at the building with an expression that was neither impressed nor dismissive. Just looking. Vivian went to the entrance door before Derek could materialize to manage the introduction. She pushed it open herself. "Mr. Cole." He looked at her without the particular kind of attention she was used to from men in business settings. That careful recalibration that happened when people remembered who she was. He either didn't know or didn't care, and she couldn't immediately tell which. "Miss Ashford." He picked up the toolbox. "Thank you for having me out. You know what you're here for." "The Jaguar." "The Jaguar," she confirmed and stepped back to let him in. He walked past her into the garage without pausing, without taking in the space the way people usually did when they entered it. Her assistant always got quiet when he came in here, like he was entering a church. Ethan walked in like it was a garage. He set his toolbox down near the center of the floor and looked at the covered car for a moment. "How long has it been since anyone ran the engine?" 8 years? He nodded slowly, still looking at the covered shape. "And before that?" "It ran. My father drove it regularly. He was meticulous about maintenance. He kept records going back to when he bought it." "Do you have those records here?" She went to the shelf along the wall and pulled down a gray binder, worn at the corners. She held it out. He took it, flipped through the first several pages, and she watched his eyes move across the handwriting. Her father's cramped, precise notation, entries going back more than 20 years. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed in some small way she couldn't identify. "You mentioned 27 restoration specialists," he said, still reading. 27. All of them looked at the engine? All of them. Some ran tests for days. One had it on his lift for 3 weeks. The consensus across every one of them was that the engine was mechanically dead. They couldn't identify a singular failure. There was no blown head gasket, no cracked block, nothing catastrophic. It simply wouldn't start, and they couldn't determine why. She paused. "Several of them told me I should keep it as a display piece and stop trying." Ethan looked up from the binder. "Did you consider that?" "I'm here, aren't I?" He almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it was close. He handed the binder back to her, walked to the Jaguar, and took hold of the fitted cloth at one corner. He glanced at her briefly, a question without words. She nodded. He pulled the cloth back in one smooth movement and laid it over the workbench nearby. The car was dark British racing green, not the bright version, but the deep old formula, the color that looked almost black in low light and turned jewel green when it caught the sun. The bodywork was pristine. She'd had it polished every 6 months regardless, because her father would have hated seeing it go dull. Chrome catches on the hood, the long, muscular hood line, the covered headlamps, wire wheels. Ethan stood back and looked at it the way Vivian had watched other people look at great paintings. Not admiring it exactly, but studying it, taking inventory of something. Then he did something none of the other 27 had done in quite the same way. He just walked around it. Slowly. Without opening anything, without touching anything, without connecting a single piece of equipment. He made one full circuit, paused, then walked around again in the other direction. At certain points, he crouched and looked at the underside. At others, he stood back and looked at the proportions of the whole car. Vivian watched him and said nothing. After several minutes, he put one hand lightly on the leading edge of the hood, not grabbing, just touching, and stayed like that for a moment with his eyes closed. "Mr. Cole?" "I'm listening," he said quietly. She stopped. He stood with his hand on the hood for another 30 seconds, eyes still closed, and she had the strange experience of understanding exactly what he meant, that he was listening to something she couldn't hear, something in the metal or the air or the memory of the machine. Then he opened the hood. He leaned in over the engine compartment for a long time. He didn't touch anything. He looked. He shifted the angle of his head, reading something from the way components sat, the way wires ran, the positioning of parts. The sound of a second vehicle pulling into the lot outside broke the quiet. Vivian recognized the car immediately when it appeared through the side window. A black Range Rover, new, with a personalized plate she'd seen before. Her stomach tightened. Victor Hale. She hadn't invited him. She knew immediately that Derek, who managed her calendar and believed in networking as a form of religion, had mentioned this appointment to someone, and somehow it had gotten back to Victor. He was exactly the kind of man who would show up uninvited to watch a competitor fail. Victor had been the 6th specialist she'd brought in 4 years ago. He'd arrived with a team of 4, a trailer full of diagnostic equipment, and a particular brand of confidence that she now recognized as the kind that fed on other people's doubt. He'd spent 4 days with the Jaguar, declared it mechanically unrevivable with more authority than anyone had before or since, and submitted a bill for his assessment time that had required 2 separate approvals from her finance team. He walked in without knocking. "Vivian," he spread his hands in a gesture meant to look like warmth. "I heard you were giving it one more shot. I couldn't resist stopping by." "Victor," her voice was even. "I don't remember inviting you." "I was in the area." He looked past her at the Jaguar, then at Ethan. A particular expression moved across his face, the kind that men like Victor tried to keep off their faces and never quite managed. Mild, pleasant contempt. "This is the specialist?" Ethan was examining a section of the wiring near the firewall. He didn't look up. "Ethan Cole," Vivian said. "He's looking at the car." "I can see that." Victor moved closer to the Jaguar, hands in the pockets of his jacket. He looked at Ethan's open toolbox on the floor, the old metal case, the worn handles on the tools visible at the top. Something in his posture changed, a minor rearrangement that communicated everything. "Where are you from, Mr. Cole?" Ethan glanced up briefly. "Small shop, edge of town." Victor looked at the car again. "I spent 4 days on this engine. My team ran every diagnostic available. I want you to understand what you're working with. The ignition system, the fuel delivery, the compression across all 6 cylinders. We tested everything. The engine isn't seized. There's no catastrophic failure. It simply will not fire. In my professional assessment, and I've been doing this for 23 years, the problem is not identifiable or correctable. The tolerances in these engines after 60-plus years, combined with non-original components that were swapped in at some point in the 80s, create a combination that modern diagnostic equipment reads as functional, but is effectively... Did anyone check the contact points? Ethan asked. Victor stopped. The question sat in the air of the garage for a moment. What? Victor said. Ethan straightened up from the engine compartment and looked at him directly. The ignition contact points in the distributor. Did your diagnostic process include a physical measurement of the contact point gap? Victor's expression cycled through several things quickly. Confusion, dismissal, and then something else. Something Vivian couldn't quite read. The contact points, he said, and there was a careful flatness in his voice now. We ran full computerized diagnostics on the ignition system. That's not what I asked. Silence. Victor turned to Vivian with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to be amused or offended. You're going to trust the car to... He hasn't given me a reason not to yet, Vivian said. She said it quietly, and she meant it, and Victor heard both things. He closed his mouth. Ethan went back to looking at the engine. He reached in and touched the distributor cap lightly, checking something with his fingers, then withdrew his hand and looked at it thoughtfully. How long has the car been sitting in this exact position in the garage? 8 years, Vivian said again, since my father died. Has anyone moved it, pushed it, rolled it at all since then? No, it was driven in here a few weeks before he passed. He'd taken it for a short drive and then brought it back. He parked it there, and it's been there. Ethan nodded. He crouched beside the driver's door, opened it. The hinges moved with the resistance of long disuse, a sound that caught in Vivian's chest in a way she hadn't prepared for, and he studied the interior without getting in. Then he stood again. The service records, he said. Your father's notes. In the entry from about 9 years ago, October, he noted a rough idle. He wrote that he'd had someone look at it and they'd adjusted the timing. Do you remember that? Vivian went very still. He mentioned it, she said slowly. I wasn't involved in the car's maintenance, but I think I remember him saying something about timing. The entry after that, the last one in the log, about a month later, says the car felt slightly off to him. Off was his word. He didn't elaborate. Ethan closed the driver's door gently. He knew something wasn't right. He just didn't know what. Vivian looked at him. You got that from reading the service record. I got that from the way he wrote it, Ethan said. He wasn't a man who used imprecise language. Every other entry in that log is specific. Mileage, parts, observations. That last entry just says off. That meant he noticed something but couldn't name it, which means it was something small. Victor made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Ethan ignored him completely. He reached into his toolbox and moved two things aside, and what he pulled out was small enough to disappear in his palm. A thin metal tool, simple, the kind that looked like it cost about as much as a sandwich. Feeler gauge, he said to no one in particular, more to himself than anyone else in the room. He opened the distributor cap and held the tool carefully over the contact points inside. He measured. He held very still. He measured again from a slightly different angle, and then he stayed in that position for a moment without moving. Vivian was watching his face. She had gotten good at reading what people's faces did when they were trying to manage what they were thinking, and what she saw in Ethan Cole's face right now was not triumph. It was something quieter, closer to recognition, the look of a person who has been searching in the dark and heard something move. "There it is," he said very quietly. Victor took a step forward despite himself. "What?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He checked the measurement one more time, then straightened. "The contact point gap is off," he said, "just under 4/1000ths of an inch. That's not much. It's barely a measurement most people would notice. But in a hand-built 1961 engine, 4/1000ths in the wrong direction means the ignition timing is never quite right. The spark fires at the wrong moment, not badly enough for modern diagnostic software to flag it as a failure, just badly enough that the engine won't run." Victor stared at him. "Someone adjusted the timing 9 years ago and got the distributor contact points wrong in the process," Ethan continued. "Slightly. Maybe they were rushing, maybe they didn't have the right spec for this particular engine. The margin of tolerance in these old engines is tighter than people realize. They weren't built by machines, they were built by people, by hand, and every one of them has small differences that you can't find in a modern diagnostic manual because the manual doesn't account for the individual car." The garage was quiet. Vivian realized her arms had come uncrossed at some point. She was standing with her hands open at her sides. "So it can be fixed," she said. "I don't know yet," he said, and she was grateful that he didn't say yes the way the others had always said yes, with that particular forward lean that meant they were selling something. He said it plainly, the way someone says something they actually mean. "It should be fixable. I need to adjust the gap carefully and check a few other things before I can say for certain, but this is why it won't start. I'm confident of that." Victor was quiet for the first time since he'd walked in. Vivian looked at the Jaguar. Under the light in the garage, the dark green of the bodywork caught the overhead fluorescents and held them, a long, elegant shape that her father had loved with a kind of devotion she'd never fully understood until she started to lose it. She hadn't let herself hope in a long time. She was good at that, at managing expectation, at building structures against disappointment. It was what had made her successful. It was also what made certain rooms in her life feel like they were made of concrete. But standing in the garage right now, watching a man she'd never met hold a $12 tool and talk about thousandths of an inch, she felt something she'd mostly stopped expecting. She felt like maybe the car was going to run again. She didn't say it. She just held it quietly, the way you hold something fragile before you know whether it's going to last. Ethan set the feeler gauge on the edge of his toolbox and reached for a small adjusting tool. "I'm going to need quiet while I work," he said, not to anyone in particular. "And I'd appreciate it if everyone stayed back from the engine." Victor said nothing. Vivian nodded. The garage went still, and Ethan Cole bent over the Jaguar's engine and got to work. Victor Hale didn't leave. Vivian had half expected him to, had actually counted on it, because Victor was the kind of man who exited rooms the moment they stopped being useful to him. But he stayed, positioning himself near the side wall with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something that was supposed to look like professional curiosity, but read more like a man waiting for a punchline he'd already written. Ethan didn't acknowledge him. He worked the way Vivian imagined surgeons worked, not the dramatic kind from television, but the real kind, the ones who moved slowly and deliberately and didn't talk while they were thinking. He had the distributor cap off and was making the first careful adjustment to the contact points with a tool that looked like it had been in his family longer than most people kept cars. Vivian moved to the workbench along the wall and sat on a stool she kept there. Her back was straight out of habit. She watched. After about 10 minutes, Victor shifted his weight and said, "Where did you train?" Ethan kept working. "Here and there? Apprenticeship? Trade school?" "Both. And a lot of time making mistakes on cars I couldn't afford to break." Victor made a sound that acknowledged this without endorsing it. "The reason computerized diagnostics have replaced manual gap measurement in professional restoration work," he said, in the tone of someone delivering information they consider charitable, "is consistency. Human measurement introduces variance, the repeatability of electronic sensors. The repeatability of electronic sensors is calibrated against modern manufacturing tolerances," Ethan said, not looking up. "This engine wasn't built to modern manufacturing tolerances. It was built in Coventry in 1961 by about 40 people working with hand tools and individual judgment. When you run current diagnostic software on a 60-year-old hand-built engine, you're comparing it against a baseline that has nothing to do with what this engine actually is." Victor paused. "That's an oversimplification." "Maybe." Ethan set down one tool and picked up another. "But the gap was wrong and nobody caught it. So..." The sentence ended there, without venom, without satisfaction. Just the fact of it, sitting in the room. Vivian watched Victor's jaw tighten slightly. She'd seen that expression on other faces, the particular tension of a man who's been correct about everything for so long that encountering something he missed has nowhere to go. She looked back at Ethan and found herself studying him the way she studied things when she was actually curious rather than just gathering information. He was maybe 32, she guessed. Hard to say exactly. There were lines around his eyes that weren't quite the lines of age, more the lines of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors and squinting at small things. His hands were careful, not elegant. There were old scars across the knuckles of his right hand, the kind that came from metal edges and not from anything gentle, but careful in the way that meant he understood the difference between force and pressure. She didn't know very much about him. The referral chain that had produced his name had been long and informal, and by the time Derek had tracked down an actual phone number, it had felt more like finding someone than hiring them. She'd asked Derek to pull together what he could before today, and what he'd found was thin. A small garage registered to an LLC, a listed address on the outskirts of town, a few mentions in automotive forums from several years back that she hadn't read carefully. Nothing that explained why 3 separate people, in 3 separate conversations, had called him the best they'd ever seen. She decided to ask, "How long have you been running the garage?" He glanced up briefly. 4 years, give or take. "And before that?" A small pause. He kept working, but something in his posture shifted, a minor change she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been paying attention. "Different things." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She let it sit there. She was good at that, at leaving space in a conversation rather than filling it. Most people filled silence eventually. It was one of the more reliable truths she'd learned in business. But Ethan Cole just kept working, and the silence didn't seem to bother him the way it bothered most people. He existed inside it comfortably, like someone who'd spent a lot of time alone and had made his peace with that. Victor, predictably, was not comfortable with it. "There's a question I have," Victor said, "about your process. You came in here without any diagnostic equipment beyond a feeler gauge. You looked at the car for, 20 minutes? Before touching the engine. What exactly were you observing during that time? Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were simply walking around." Ethan finished what he was doing before answering. He set the tool down and checked his work carefully, bending close to the distributor. "I was listening," he said finally. "To what?" "The car wasn't running." "Doesn't have to be running." He straightened up. "A car that's been sitting for 8 years in a climate-controlled garage with regular cosmetic maintenance but no mechanical engagement. It tells you things. The way it sits on the suspension, whether there's been any fluid seep, the condition of rubber components that should have dried and cracked and haven't, which tells you about the environment, the smell of the interior, whether the leather has been treated or just cleaned, small things. Those things told you to look at the contact points." "No, the service record told me to look at the contact points. The car told me the service record was worth reading carefully." Victor stared at him. That's circular. Is it? Ethan reached for a clean rag and wiped the tip of the adjustment tool. The previous owner, her father, was meticulous. Every entry in that log is precise. He was an engineer by training. You can tell from the way he documented things. So when the last entry uses a vague word, that's not sloppiness. That's a precise man encountering something he couldn't precisely name. That's worth attention. Vivian had gone very still on her stool. Her father. The word in Ethan's mouth, applied to the man who'd kept that log, had landed somewhere she hadn't been expecting. Not because it was wrong, but because it was so plainly stated, without the careful softness people usually applied when referencing someone who had died. Just her father. A precise man. Someone worth paying attention to. She swallowed. Victor said something else, but Vivian didn't track it. She was looking at the Jaguar. Her father had bought it when she was 11 years old, before the money, when he was still building the company and every significant purchase required calculation. She remembered him coming home with it on a Tuesday evening and parking it in the driveway and calling her outside, not her mother, specifically her. And she remembered standing beside him in the fading afternoon light while he explained things about the car she was too young to retain. She'd watched his face more than she'd listened. He'd looked the way he looked at almost nothing else. Like a person completely inside a moment. She'd asked him once, when she was in college, why he loved it so much. He'd thought about it for a long time before answering. Because it was built by people who cared, he'd said. You can tell the difference, even 60 years later. It's in the tolerances, it's in the details they didn't have to get right, but got right anyway. She hadn't fully understood it then. She thought she understood it a little better now, watching a man she didn't know bend over the engine of the car her father had loved, looking for something that was only slightly wrong. She became aware that Victor was looking at her. I want to ask you something, he said, dropping the formal register slightly. Privately, if possible. She glanced at Ethan, who had his attention fully back on the engine and gave no indication of caring either way. You can ask it here, she said. Victor lowered his voice anyway, a habit of the kind. You've spent, I don't know the exact figure, but a substantial amount, on restoration attempts over 8 years, and you're now pinning a significant amount of hope on someone whose qualifications you've told me you can't verify, using a manual approach that every serious restoration professional has moved away from. I understand this car has sentimental value. I'm not dismissing that. But at what point does the sentimental value become a reason to let go rather than a reason to keep? Victor. Her voice was quiet and completely final. You drove here uninvited. You can stay and watch, or you can leave. Those are the options I'm offering. Something moved across his face. Not embarrassment exactly, but adjacent to it. He nodded once and said nothing else. Ethan made a small sound that might have been something and might have been nothing, and kept working. The afternoon moved forward in increments. Around 2 o'clock, Derek appeared at the door with 2 coffees and a carrier, which Vivian suspected he'd driven out to get rather than producing from the building's kitchen, because the kitchen coffee was bad, and Derek was constitutionally incapable of offering bad coffee in a tense situation. She took one. Ethan shook his head without looking up. Derek left the carrier on the workbench and retreated. Victor eventually accepted the second cup. By 2:30, Ethan had finished with the distributor and moved to a secondary inspection of the fuel system. Not a deep investigation, more a confirmation, checking that none of the other components had degraded in a way that would undercut what he'd corrected. He worked methodically, and he worked alone, and the only sounds in the garage were the small sounds of tools and the occasional traffic noise from the road outside. It was just past 3 when his phone rang. He straightened, checked the screen, and his whole demeanor changed in a way that was immediate and obvious. Not alarmed, just present in a different way, like a different part of him had been activated. I need to take this, he said. Excuse me. He stepped toward the door, not fully outside, staying where he could still see the garage but speaking quietly. Vivian wasn't trying to hear the conversation. She'd spent her professional life in environments where people eavesdropped, and she had a particular distaste for it. But the garage was not large and sound carried. She caught fragments. Yeah, I'm still here. No, it's okay. Is she... A pause. Longer. Put her on. Then his voice changed again, dropped to something private and quiet. Hey, Bug. How was school? Another pause. A short sound that was almost a laugh. I know. 2 more hours, okay? Maybe 3. Can you? Pause. I know Mrs. Delvecchio is boring. Everyone's teacher is boring. That's what teachers are for. Something else, too quiet to catch. And then, very distinctly, I'll be home for dinner. I promise. Yeah. Okay. Bye, Bug. Bye, Bug. He came back in, dropped the phone in his shirt pocket. He kicked in and picked up his tools again. Nobody said anything. Victor was looking at his own phone. Vivian looked at the Jaguar. The call had lasted maybe 90 seconds, and Ethan had already moved back into the engine compartment as if it hadn't happened, but the shape of it remained in the room. A child. A specific child, a Bug, whatever that meant, whatever the history was behind a nickname like that, waiting at school. Waiting for him. Vivian thought about what the referral chain had mentioned, almost in passing, the details she'd half-registered and then set aside. Single father. She looked at him now with that detail reinstated, as if it had been sitting in a drawer and she'd just opened it. The work shirt with the sleeves pushed up, the truck with the dent, the toolbox that was old but organized, the way he'd said 2 more hours, maybe 3, with the precision of someone calculating margins. He wasn't here to impress her. He was here because someone needed to fix the car, and he could fix the car, and then he needed to get home for dinner. She found this oddly clarifying. Do you want to take a break? She asked. I'm fine. He was already checking the fuel line junction. I'm not offering because I think you need one. I'm offering because we've been in here for 3 hours and I could use one. He paused and looked at her. Then he set down his tools. Okay. 10 minutes. They ended up outside, which Vivian hadn't planned, but which happened naturally. She moved toward the side door for air, and he followed, and they stood on the narrow concrete apron beside the building with the afternoon sun cutting across the parking lot at a low angle. Victor remained inside. Through the window, she could see him standing near the Jaguar, studying the engine with his arms crossed and his reading glasses on, though he wasn't touching anything. Your daughter? She asked. Yeah. He looked at the gravel. She's 8. She thinks school is a long meeting she didn't ask to be in. She's not wrong. Something in his expression shifted, almost a smile again, getting slightly closer than it had before. No, she's really not. Vivian leaned against the building. The concrete was warm from the sun. She thought about what to say, and then said the thing she was actually thinking rather than the polished version, "Where's her mother?" She wasn't sure why she asked it. It was not the kind of question she typically asked strangers, but something about this afternoon, the garage, the car, the service record in her father's handwriting, had worn down whatever apparatus usually filtered her questions. He didn't flinch. He just looked at the gravel for a moment longer and said, "She left when Mara was 3. She's in Portland now. She calls on birthdays." He paused. Most birthdays. Vivian didn't say she was sorry. She had learned over the years that people said that reflexively, and it usually meant less than silence. Instead, she said, "Mara's a good name. Her grandmother's name." He looked up from the gravel and out at the lot. "She's a good kid. She talks too much and she can't sit still, and she corrects people when they mispronounce things, which, embarrassing at restaurants. But she's a good kid." Vivian thought about being 8 years old and sitting next to a car in a driveway and watching someone's face. "My father used to take me to car shows when I was her age," she said. "I didn't care about the cars at all. I just liked watching him look at them." Ethan nodded. He seemed to understand this without requiring elaboration, which was something. A car passed on the road outside the lot, slowing slightly and then moving on. The afternoon was quieting down. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian said. "You've been asking me things for 3 hours." "This is different." She looked at him directly. "The referrals that brought you to me, 3 separate people, none of whom knew each other, all said the same thing, that you were the best they'd ever seen. One of them said he'd tried for 2 years to hire you back, and you kept saying no." She paused. "That's not what a man who runs a roadside garage sounds like." He was quiet for a moment, The kind of quiet that meant he was deciding something, not avoiding something. I did restoration work for about 5 years, he said finally. High-end stuff. Vintage, British, and Italian mostly. Worked with some of the better shops in the country. Got to a point where I was getting my own commissions, traveling for work. He stopped and turned a small stone over with the toe of his boot. Then Mara's mother left, and I had a 3-year-old, sorry. And I was gone 3 weeks out of 4, and I had to make a choice about what kind of father I was going to be. So you stopped? I stopped the travel and the prestige jobs, yeah. Opened the garage. It's not complicated. It is, actually, Vivian said quietly. Most people don't make that choice. He looked at her, and for a moment the quality of his attention was different. Not professional or guarded, just present. One person looking at another in an ordinary afternoon and recognizing something. I'm not doing it for recognition, he said. I couldn't be the other version of myself and also be a decent father, and one of those mattered more. Vivian nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. They stood there for another minute or two without talking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that two people share when they've said something true and are letting it settle. Then he pushed off the wall. I should get back to it. Yes, she said. You should. They went back inside. Victor had moved away from the engine when they entered, back to his spot by the wall, arms recrossed. He watched them come in with an expression that Vivian recognized as one she'd seen in boardrooms, the expression of someone recalculating. Ethan went back to the car without looking at either of them. He spent another 40 minutes completing his checks, the ignition system itself, the high-tension leads, the carburetors, which on a 6-cylinder XKE required their own consideration. He worked through each item with the same steady methodology, occasionally making a minor adjustment, occasionally looking at something for a long time without touching it before moving on. At one point, he found a degraded seal on one of the carburetor dashpots and spent 15 minutes addressing it with materials from his toolbox, not because it was the core problem, but because it would have undermined performance if left alone. Victor watched this. That's a Series 1 dashpot seal, he said eventually. Yes. The original specification is, I know the specification. Ethan didn't say it harshly, just directly. Victor was quiet. Ethan finished. He stepped back from the engine, wiped his hands on a clean rag, and looked at the car for a moment with his head slightly tilted. He was checking something in his mind, running through the list of what he'd done, Vivian guessed, making sure nothing had been overlooked. His eyes moved across the engine compartment in a slow circuit. Then he looked at her. I want to try starting it, he said. I'm not promising anything. The timing adjustment should address the primary issue, and the carburetor seal will help sustain fuel delivery, but this engine has been dormant for 8 years and there could be secondary issues that only present when it's actually running. If it starts, he paused. We listen. We don't rev it. We let it find itself. Vivian stood up from the stool. All right. Victor had come off the wall without appearing to notice he'd done it. Is there anything you need me to do? She asked. Stay back from the engine, and he looked at both of them. I need quiet. Real quiet. If this works, the first 30 seconds of how it runs are going to tell me a lot, and I need to hear them. The garage went still in a way that felt deliberate, like everyone in it had taken a collective breath and held it. Ethan opened the driver's door, that same sound of long, stiff hinges, the slight resistance of 8 years, and sat down behind the wheel. He pulled the door closed. Through the windshield, Vivian could see him settling in the seat, adjusting slightly, looking at the dash. Her father's steering wheel. Her father's dash, with the row of toggle switches he'd shown her once, naming each one like they were members of a small household. Her father's handprints, worn into the leather in the places he'd always held it. She pressed her arms against her sides and waited. Ethan put his hand on the ignition key, the key that her father had carried on a leather fob for more than 20 years, that her mother had given Vivian in a small envelope after the funeral, that Vivian had brought to every restoration attempt and taken home again each time and put back in the drawer of her nightstand where it lived between appointments. Ethan turned the key. The starter motor engaged, a hard mechanical churning sound that filled the garage and then fell away into nothing as the engine failed to catch. The silence after it was very loud. Victor made no expression. He was very carefully making no expression. Ethan sat for a moment without moving. Then he opened the door, got out, and leaned back into the engine compartment. He made one adjustment, small, focused, done in about 45 seconds. Then closed the hood most of the way, leaving it unlatched. He got back in the car, looked at the dash again, put his hand on the key. Vivian felt something in her chest that she would not have been able to name precisely. Not hope exactly, because hope was something she'd carefully rationed out of her relationship with this car over 8 years of professional disappointment. It was something more involuntary than hope. It was the thing that lives under hope, in the part of you that doesn't negotiate. Ethan turned the key. The starter motor caught again, that same churning, and then something shifted in the sound, a different texture in the mechanical noise, and then the engine fired. Not smoothly, not immediately. It came up ragged and uncertain, misfiring twice, 3 times, and for one suspended second it sounded like it was going to die. But Ethan held the choke steady and kept his hand off the throttle and let the engine find what it was looking for, and it did. It steadied, caught itself, and then settled into an idle. A real idle. A living, breathing, running idle. The sound came up through the concrete floor and the walls of the garage and filled the air with something that was not just mechanical. It was the sound of a specific machine, with a specific history and a specific voice, waking up after a very long time. Vivian's hand went to her mouth. She didn't mean it to. It happened before she'd decided anything. Through the windshield, she could see Ethan's face. He was listening, head slightly tilted, eyes moving, reading the engine the way he'd been reading everything else since he arrived. His expression was not triumphant. It was focused. But there was something in it, a quiet, private quality that she recognized as the expression of someone hearing something they were glad to hear. Victor Hale stood against the wall with his arms no longer crossed. His arms were down. He was just standing there watching the running car, and on his face was something Vivian had never seen in 4 years of interactions with him. Something that looked, despite every obvious reason it shouldn't, very much like respect. The engine ran on. Outside, the late afternoon had gone golden and flat, and the light came through the side window in a long angle that crossed the garage floor and reached the Jaguar's hood. The dark green paint caught it and held it the way it always had, the way her father had described it once, standing in just this kind of light, saying something about colors that lived in metal and didn't leave. She stood in the middle of her father's garage and listened to his car breathe, and she didn't cry, or at least she almost didn't cry, which for Vivian Ashford counted as doing fine. After 2 minutes, Ethan shut the engine off. He sat in the car for a moment with his hands in his lap. Then he got out, closed the door carefully, and came around to the front. He looked at Vivian. "It needs more work," he said. "There's a slight roughness on the 3rd cylinder that I want to investigate before anyone drives it. The idle is good, but the full RPM range. I'd want to run it properly before I tell you it's ready. And the fuel lines should all be inspected for any deterioration." He stopped and looked at the car. "But the engine runs. The core problem was what I thought it was." Vivian nodded. She trusted herself to do that much. She nodded, and she kept her hand away from her face, and she looked at the car. "Thank you," she said. He nodded back, which was the response of a man who received thanks comfortably and didn't require anything more from it. Victor cleared his throat. "That's..." He stopped, started again. "The contact point gap. I wouldn't have thought to check manually. The diagnostics showed the ignition system as within tolerance." "Within modern tolerance," Ethan said, not unkindly. "Yes." Victor looked at the car for a moment. "Within modern tolerance." He seemed to be working something out internally, and to his credit, he worked it out honestly. "I've been doing this for 23 years. I've worked on cars far more deteriorated than this one. The gap measurement..." He stopped again. "I should have checked it manually, regardless of what the software showed. I should have checked." Nobody argued with him. That was its own kind of answer. Ethan began packing his toolbox, unhurried, putting each tool back in the specific place it lived. Vivian watched him and thought about what he'd said outside, that he'd made a choice about who he was going to be, that one version of himself had mattered more than the other. She thought about her father and the precise entries in the service log, right up until the last one. The word off, standing alone. A precise man encountering something he couldn't name. She thought about a child named Mara, who corrected people's pronunciation and found school boring and was waiting somewhere for her father to come home for dinner. She thought about all the things that were slightly out of place, a few thousandths of an inch, a small gap, barely measurable, and what happened when the right person finally looked in the right direction. Ethan closed the toolbox and picked up the handle. "I'd like to come back," he said, "if that's all right. Finish the inspection properly. Make sure the whole car is right before anyone takes it on the road." "Yes," she said. "Come back." He nodded. He looked at the Jaguar one more time, the same look he'd given it when he first arrived, that quiet inventory of something worth understanding. And then he picked up his toolbox and walked toward the door. He was almost through it when Vivian said, "Mr. Cole?" He turned. "You said your daughter thinks school is a long meeting she didn't ask to be in." She paused. "You should tell her that a lot of important things in life are exactly that, but sometimes something happens in them that makes it worth staying till the end." He looked at her for a moment, and this time the almost smile got a little further than it had before. "I'll tell her," he said. And then he went through the door, and a few seconds later she heard the white pickup start in the gravel lot, a reliable, unhurried engine sound, nothing dramatic, and pull away. Victor was already reaching for his phone, already moving back into the version of himself that operated in the world of cars and reputation and professional standing. He would process what had happened today, Vivian knew, and incorporate it or not, and it would or wouldn't change something about the way he worked. She didn't particularly care which. She turned back to the Jaguar and stood in front of it for a long time. The engine had been quiet for 10 minutes now, but something of its sound remained in the air of the garage. Or maybe in her. The low, even voice of a machine that had been waiting a very long time to be heard, finally saying what it had always been trying to say. She reached out and laid one hand on the hood. The metal was warm. He came back on a Thursday. Vivian knew he was coming. They'd agreed on 10 o'clock, and at 9:58 she heard the white pickup in the gravel lot and found herself already standing near the garage entrance, which she hadn't planned. She'd spent the intervening 2 days telling herself she wasn't thinking about the car, or the sound it had made, or the man who'd produced that sound. And she'd been largely unsuccessful at all three. She'd also spent part of those 2 days doing something she hadn't done in years, reading her father's service records again. Not skimming for information to pass along to a specialist, actually reading, her father's handwriting, cramped and precise, filling the narrow lines of the log with dates and mileages and observations spanning more than 2 decades. She'd sat with the gray binder on her kitchen table on Wednesday evening with a glass of wine she'd barely touched, and read every entry from the beginning. And somewhere around the 3rd year of records, she'd had to stop and look at the wall for a while before she could continue. The log ended the way Ethan had noted. That final entry, the word off sitting at the end of a line like something unresolved. She'd looked at it for a long time. Her father had known something was wrong. He just hadn't known what, and then he'd run out of time to find out. She thought about that more than she wanted to. Ethan came through the door carrying the same toolbox, wearing a different work shirt. Dark blue this time, same style, sleeves already pushed up despite the morning cool. He nodded at her the way people nod when they've already established a working understanding and don't need to rebuild it from scratch each time. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She moved aside to let him pass. "Coffee's on the workbench." Derek brought a proper setup this time. He felt bad about the cups from Tuesday. Ethan looked at the small coffee maker on the workbench, the kind that produced something drinkable rather than something functional, and seemed mildly surprised by it. "Tell him thank you." "I'll pass that along. He'll be extremely gratified." The ghost of an expression crossed his face and disappeared. He set the toolbox down and went to the Jaguar. The car was exactly as he'd left it, hood unlatched, cloth folded on the workbench. Vivian had not covered it again after Tuesday. She hadn't made a conscious decision about that. She'd just found herself leaving it uncovered, the dark green bodywork visible in the garage light every time she came in. It felt wrong to cover it again after it had run, like putting a sheet over someone who was awake. Ethan poured himself a coffee, took one sip, set it aside for later, and lifted the hood. He worked through the morning systematically, and Vivian learned quickly that the rhythm of his second visit was different from the first. Tuesday had been investigation. He'd been reading the car, mapping it, finding the thing everyone else had missed. Today was different. Today he knew what the car was and what it needed, and the work had a different quality to it, more fluid, less searching. He moved through the engine compartment with a confidence that wasn't performance. It was just competence operating at its natural speed. She stayed in the garage. She had her laptop and a stack of things she'd brought to work on, and she set them up on a folding table Derek had produced, and she worked through emails and a contract review while Ethan worked on the car. It was an odd domestic arrangement, two people occupying the same space in parallel, and she noticed after an hour that she'd cleared more from her inbox than she typically managed in a full morning at her office. Something about the quality of the quiet, maybe. Or about having a reason to be in the room. Around 11, Ethan said without preamble. "Tell me about your father." She looked up from her laptop. He wasn't looking at her. He was examining the fuel lines along the firewall, following each one with a careful hand. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement rather than a solicitation, but she understood it was a question. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. The log tells me how he maintained the car. It doesn't tell me who he was." She considered this. "Why does that matter for the repair?" "It doesn't," he said. "I'm just asking." She looked at the screen for a moment, then she closed the laptop. "He was an engineer," she said. "Structural. He built bridges for 20 years before he started the company. He had the kind of mind that approached problems the way you approach them. Everything has a root cause. You just have to find it. He was patient, more patient than most people I've ever met." She paused. He was also terrible at being told no. Not in an aggressive way. He just genuinely didn't register it as the end of a conversation. "That's where you get it," Ethan said. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "The 27 specialists." He moved the light to check under a fuel line junction. "Most people stop at 4 or 5 when something can't be fixed. 27 is someone who genuinely doesn't register no as the end of a conversation." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." He nodded, still not looking at her. What did he love about this car specifically? She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for 2 days, in a way, without quite forming the thoughts into words. He said it was the last generation of cars that were built with genuine individual variation, she said slowly. He'd read everything about it, the factory records from Coventry, the production histories. He knew that the workers who built these engines did it by hand, by measurement, and feel and judgment. And he said you could tell. He said if you knew how to listen, every E-Type had its own specific voice and its own specific character, and that character came from the people who built it. She stopped. Something in saying it aloud brought it closer than she'd expected. He said machines carry the people who made them, she said. In the tolerances, in the details. He said that was why it mattered how carefully something was made, because that care didn't go away. It stayed in the object. Ethan had stopped moving. He was standing with his hand resting lightly on the edge of the engine compartment, looking at something in the middle distance, and his expression was the particular one she'd begun to recognize, the one that meant he was processing something that had connected with something else. He was right, Ethan said quietly. I know. He stayed like that for a moment, and then he went back to the fuel lines, and neither of them spoke for a while. By midday, Ethan had completed the fuel system inspection and was satisfied with the lines. No deterioration significant enough to affect performance, which he attributed to the controlled environment of the garage and the quality of the work done by whoever had last replaced them, which the service log indicated was her father himself, in an entry from about 12 years back. He replaced his own fuel lines? Ethan asked, looking at the log entry. He learned basic mechanics before he could afford to hire mechanics, Vivian said. He said if you didn't understand how something worked, you couldn't properly judge whether someone was maintaining it right. Ethan looked at the entry for another moment. Good philosophy. Most of his were. They ate lunch without planning to. Vivian had called Derek, and Derek had produced sandwiches from somewhere, and they sat on opposite sides of the folding table in the garage with the Jaguar between them and ate and talked, or didn't talk, in roughly equal measure. "How's Mara?" Vivian asked at one point. "In a fight with her best friend," he said, "over something that happened at lunch yesterday. I got a full briefing at dinner. It lasted 40 minutes. Who's at fault?" "Her friend, clearly, according to Mara." He picked up his coffee. "According to the available evidence, it's more complicated." "Did you tell her that?" "I told her that people we care about sometimes do things that are thoughtless, and it doesn't mean they don't care about us." He paused. She thought about it for about 10 seconds and then said that was basically just telling her to get over it. Vivian almost laughed. "She's not wrong." "No," he said. "She's really not." He set the cup down. "She's 8 and she already catches every hole in an argument. I don't know if I'm raising her or she's raising me." Vivian thought about being 8 and following her father around job sites when he was still doing field work, asking him questions about the bridges he was building until the foreman looked pained. Her father had never told her to stop asking. He'd answered every question until she ran out of them, and then he'd ask her what she thought the next question should be. "The ones who catch holes in arguments early," she said, "they're exhausting at 8. They're exceptional at 30. He looked at her across the folding table. "You speaking from experience?" "Both sides of it." He nodded once. It was the nod of someone who understood exactly what she meant and didn't need her to explain further. After lunch, he moved to the third cylinder. The roughness he'd noted when the engine first ran, the issue he'd flagged as needing proper investigation. He pulled the spark plug on the third cylinder and examined it under a work light for a long time, turning it slowly. "What are you seeing?" Vivian asked. "The plug's fouled," he said. "Not badly, but enough. It's been running rich on this cylinder, more fuel than air relative to the others, which means either the needle jet in that carburetor is slightly out of position or the needle itself has some wear." He set the plug on a clean rag. "It's probably been running slightly rough on this cylinder for a few years before it stopped starting. Your father may have felt it as part of what he described as off." Vivian came and stood next to him, close enough to see what he was looking at. The plug was dark at the tip, the deposits of a mixture that had been slightly wrong for some time. "Can you fix it?" "Yes." "It'll take a couple hours. The carburetors on this engine," he stopped, recalibrated. "They're finicky. Each one has to be set to the others, not just to a spec. They have to agree with each other. If I adjust one without checking the relationship to the other two, I'll create a different problem." "Like the ignition timing someone adjusted without checking the contact gap." He glanced at her. "Exactly like that." She looked at the spark plug on the rag, dark at the tip. A cylinder that had been running wrong for years, quietly, without anyone identifying it, while the car continued to run and her father continued to drive it until the combination of the slightly wrong timing and the slightly fouled third cylinder and whatever else had accumulated in the margins added up to a car that finally refused to start at all. Not one catastrophic failure, a collection of small things, each minor on its own, compounding over time until the whole became unsustainable. She'd seen that pattern before. In companies, mostly. Businesses that collapsed not because of one bad decision, but because of dozens of small misalignments that nobody caught until it was too late. She was, in a way, professionally occupied with identifying compounding small failures, the things that looked fine on paper but were fractionally off in reality. She'd just never applied it to a car before. "My father knew something was wrong," she said, "but he didn't know what. And then he died before he could find out." "Yes." "If someone had caught it when he first noticed, the off, the car might have kept running." "Probably." Ethan didn't soften it. "The timing issue on its own wasn't catastrophic. The carburetor issue on its own wasn't catastrophic. Together, over time, without correction," he picked up the spark plug again. "Things that are slightly wrong have a way of getting more wrong." She stood there looking at the engine for a moment. "You know," she said, "every specialist who came in here told me the car was beyond fixing, and most of them had the technology to have found what you found." "Yes." "So what's the difference?" He thought about this for longer than she expected. He wasn't reaching for a quick answer. He was actually considering it. "I think," he said slowly, "most people come to a problem with a conclusion they're testing rather than a question they're asking. The computer said the ignition system was within tolerance, so the ignition system was ruled out. The conclusion was written by the software. Nobody went back and asked whether the software was asking the right question." He put the spark plug in his shirt pocket. "I came in with a question, not an answer." What was the question? What has this specific car, built by specific hands, been trying to tell people for 8 years that nobody's been in a position to hear? Vivian looked at him. "That's a strange way to think about a mechanical problem," she said. "Maybe." He moved toward his toolbox. "But it's the car your father loved, and he said machines carry the people who made them. I figured it was worth listening." She didn't have an answer to that. She wasn't sure one was needed. He spent the next 2 hours on the carburetors with the focused intensity of someone diffusing something. The 3 SU carburetors on the XKE Inline 6 were a matched system, and setting them properly required an iterative process. Adjust one, check the relationship to the others, adjust again, check again. That couldn't be rushed without introducing new errors. Vivian watched when she wasn't working and worked when watching became too much like waiting. At one point, a car pulled into the gravel lot outside, idled briefly, and left. At another, Derek called with something that needed a signature, and she handled it in 5 minutes without moving from the garage. The afternoon had its own specific gravity, and she didn't want to leave it. Around 3:30, Ethan straightened and said, "I need to run it again." "All right. This time I want to let it run longer. 5 minutes at idle, then I'll bring the RPMs up carefully and see how it responds across the range. If the third cylinder is still rough at higher RPM, I'll need to go back in." He looked at her. "But I think we got it." "You think?" "I don't say things I'm sure of until I'm sure of them." "I've noticed," she said. He almost smiled. It was becoming a familiar almost. She stood back, the same position as Tuesday, far enough from the engine to give him room, close enough that she'd hear and feel everything the car produced when it ran. He got in. Door closed. The same sequence she'd watched 2 days ago, except now she knew what was coming, or hoped she did, and that was its own kind of tension. The tension of wanting something so specifically that you can feel the shape of the disappointment if it doesn't arrive. The key turned, the starter motor engaged, and the engine fired. Not ragged this time, not uncertain. It came up with a steadiness that was different from Tuesday's fragile first idle, more grounded, more sure of itself. The sound of something that had found its footing. The engine settled at idle and then stayed there, even and low, filling the garage with a voice that Vivian felt in her sternum. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She let herself do that. When she opened them, Ethan was sitting behind the wheel, head slightly tilted, listening. She watched his expression moving through something, reading the engine's behavior the way a person reads a complicated text, tracking multiple things simultaneously. His right hand rested on the gear lever without gripping it. His left was in his lap. After 2 full minutes at idle, he brought the revs up. Carefully, in stages, a gentle increase, held for several seconds, then higher, held again. The engine's voice changed with each increment, moved up in register, stayed even. At the higher range, it produced a sound that was unmistakably, specifically, the sound of this engine in particular. The way a voice is recognizable not just as a voice, but as a specific person's voice. Vivian put a hand over her mouth. She did it before she knew she was going to. She'd heard recordings of this engine. Her father had made a recording years ago, playing it on his phone to her once during a conversation about the car. She'd almost forgotten about that. But recordings were flat. They didn't move through you the way sound moved through you when you were standing in the same space as its source. This was not a recording. This was the car, alive, doing what it was built to do in the year Vivian's father was 2 years old, built by 40 people in Coventry who cared about the tolerances and the details and the things they didn't have to get right, but got right anyway. And it had been waiting, under a cloth in a garage, through 27 failed attempts, through 8 years of silence, for someone to ask the right question. Ethan brought the engine back down to idle, held it there for another minute, and shut it off. He sat in the car. Vivian waited. He got out, came around to the front, lifted the unlatched hood, and looked at the engine with the same careful attention he always gave it. He checked a few things with his hands: temperature, vibration residue, small things. Then he lowered the hood. He turned and looked at her. "It's clean," he said. "All 6 cylinders. The third is running correctly now. The idle is where it should be, and the RPM range is good." He paused. "The car is sound." Vivian exhaled. She didn't realize until she let it go that she'd been holding something in her chest for 2 days, maybe longer, maybe 8 years. "There are a few additional things I'd recommend doing before regular driving," he continued. "The rubber on the brake lines should be inspected. I can see the front lines and they look acceptable, but a car this age after a long dormancy, you want eyes on all of it before you put it on the road. And the tires are holding pressure, but I'd want to know their age before I'd feel comfortable. Ethan," he stopped. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something in him received it without deflecting it, which was not always how people received gratitude. A lot of people, in Vivian's experience, deflected it immediately because sitting still under it was uncomfortable. He just accepted it and nodded. "I'll make a list of the recommended items," he said. "Things I can do. Things that need a specialist in brakes or tires. I can help you source whoever you need." "All right." He went to the workbench and found a small notepad in his toolbox. An actual paper notepad, the kind that had been clipped and unclipped from something so many times the corners were soft. And he sat on the stool and wrote out the list in handwriting that was plain and clear and nothing like her father's cramped precision, but had its own legibility. She watched him write and thought about how odd it was that this man had entered her life through the most convoluted possible chain of referrals and had, in the space of 2 days, done what 27 other people with better equipment and more public reputations had not. He handed her the notepad. She read through the list. 7 items. Each one described plainly, with a note beside it indicating the level of urgency. Can wait? Should address soon. Address before driving. "The brake lines are addressed before driving," she said. "Yes, non-negotiable." "Understood." She set the notepad on the workbench. "I'll call you before I schedule anyone for the work." He was already beginning to pack the toolbox, the same methodical return of each tool to its place. She watched his hands and thought about a detail that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Tuesday, something Derek had mentioned offhandedly when she'd gotten home that evening and called to debrief. She hadn't asked about it yet. She'd been waiting for a moment that felt right. "Can I ask you something?" "Still asking," he said without looking up from the toolbox. "Derek looked you up more carefully after Tuesday." She kept her tone neutral. "He found some things that weren't in the original referral. A restoration project from about 6 years ago, a 1958 Ferrari 250 GT that came through a shop in Connecticut that had been declared unrestorable. They said the car ran again after you worked on it. Then a 1963 Aston Martin DB5 the year after, engine that 6 other specialists had written off. Both cars ran after you looked at them." She paused. "There was also a mention in a trade publication from about 7 years ago. They called you one of the most gifted vintage mechanics in the country." His hand slowed slightly on the toolbox. Not stopped, just slowed. "Derek's thorough," he said. "I pay him to be thorough." She waited. "The article also mentioned that you turned down a partnership at a well-established restoration firm, a significant offer, and then, about 6 months after the article ran, you apparently left the field entirely." "I told you why I left." "You told me part of it." She wasn't accusing him. She genuinely wanted to understand. "You said it was about Mara, and I believe you. But walking away from that level of recognition, I've made hard choices. I know what they cost. That's not a simple calculation." He closed the toolbox lid. He didn't latch it immediately. He stood with one hand resting on top of it. "The partnership offer," he said. "The firm was good. Legitimate work, real cars, people who knew what they were doing. And the offer was, it was good, financially and professionally." He stopped. "Mara was 3. Her mother had just left. And the partner who made the offer told me, specifically, explicitly, that the expectation was 60 to 70 hours a week minimum, extensive travel, client entertainment. He said it sincerely. He thought he was being honest with me about what the opportunity actually was." "He was," Vivian said. "He was, Ethan agreed. And I sat with it for 3 days. I did the math on what it would mean for Mara, who would take care of her, how often I'd be home, what she'd remember about her childhood. He picked up the toolbox handle. I couldn't make the math work in a direction I could live with. So you walked away from everything you'd built. I walked away from the version of it that required her to grow up without me in it. He shrugged. The garage isn't nothing. I work on real cars and I charge fair prices and I'm home for dinner. There are worse things. Vivian thought about the empire she'd built. The company, the portfolio, the reputation. She'd built it without anyone asking her to choose between it and something else, which was its own kind of luck, and she recognized it as such. The cost of that had been other things, quieter absences that she'd filed away rather than examined. Did you ever regret it? She asked. Which part? The choice. He thought about it. He was honest in his thinking, which she'd come to expect. He didn't immediately produce a reassuring answer. Some days, he said. When there's a car I'd have loved to work on and I hear someone else got it, or when the money's tight and I'm doing the math on whether Mara can do the things she wants to do. He paused. But I've never regretted going home for dinner, not once. Vivian looked at the Jaguar and looked at. Her father had built his company after 20 years of building bridges. He'd chosen the order deliberately. Career first, then enterprise, then the things that lasted. The Jaguar had been part of his later years after the choosing had mostly been done. He'd had the luxury of sequence. Most people didn't. The people who sent me your name, she said. 3 of them. All of them said you were the best they'd ever seen. Do you know they all said that? He looked at her. I didn't, he said. They did. She picked up the notepad with his list of recommended work. For whatever it's worth. He was quiet for a moment. It's worth something, he said. And then he picked up the toolbox and didn't elaborate, which was, she was learning exactly how he operated. He received things and acknowledged them and then moved on without mining them for more than they naturally yielded. She walked him out. At the door he stopped and looked back at the Jaguar one more time. The car sat in the afternoon light. Hood closed now, bodywork bright in a way it hadn't been when it was just a covered shape, and looked entirely different from the thing it had been 48 hours ago. Not because anything visible had changed, because something inside it had changed. Your father knew the car was off, Ethan said, still looking at it, and he was going to figure it out. He just didn't have enough time. No. He would have found it eventually. Someone like him with those records, paying that kind of attention, he would have gotten there. Vivian looked at the car too. I think so. He was the right person for it, Ethan said. And then you were the right person for finding someone who could do it in his place. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood beside him in the doorway and looked at the car her father had loved, now running again, its engine quiet but present in the room, the way a person is present in a room even when they're not speaking. He would have liked you, she said. Ethan glanced at her sideways. Because of the contact points? He asked. Because you read the log, she said. Because you read his handwriting and understood what off meant, and you took it seriously. She paused. He would have liked anyone who took his careful work seriously. Ethan nodded, just one once, the same nod as before, receiving something without requiring more from it. He went through the door. She stood in the entrance and listened to the pickup start in the gravel lot. Reliable, unhurried, the engine of a vehicle that was not glamorous and didn't need to be, and watched it back out of the lot and onto the road. When it was gone, she turned back into the garage. The Jaguar waited in the afternoon light, dark green and still, the hood latched now, chrome catching a particular angle of sun through the high side window. 8 years of silence and 36 hours of work, and it sat there looking exactly as it had always looked, which was the strange thing about fixing something that was built to last. When you got it right, the thing itself didn't look different. It just was different. The difference was in what it could now do rather than in how it appeared. She walked toward it slowly. She reached out and lay both hands flat on the hood this time, not one. Stood there with the warm metal under her palms. She thought about what Ethan had said, about her father knowing something was wrong and not having enough time, about being the right person for a thing, and what that meant, and whether it was something you earned or something you simply were. She thought about the service record, the precise entries that filled a gray binder from cover to cover, the last entry, standing alone, off. Her father had known he just needed someone to listen to what he couldn't quite name, to take the small, barely measurable things seriously, to bring the right question to the right machine at the right moment. She stood in the garage with her hands on the hood of the car and thought about how long certain things wait to be understood, and how rarely they give up waiting entirely, and what it meant to be the person who finally arrived. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening. The light through the side window was shifting, going lower and warmer, the particular quality of late afternoon light that reminded her of car shows and driveways, and a man naming toggle switches one by one as if they mattered. They had mattered. Everything her father had paid careful attention to had mattered. She stood there for a long time before she finally took her hands off the hood and went inside to make the calls. The brake line specialist came on Monday. His name was Gareth Poole, and he'd been recommended by Ethan, a short text message the morning after Thursday's session that read, "Gareth Poole for the brakes. Tell him the car. He'll know what to do." No phone number, which meant Derek had to find one, which Derek did in 40 minutes while mildly complaining about the informality of the referral system. Gareth arrived in a van with his own lighting rig and spent 4 hours under the Jaguar without saying much. And when he emerged, he told Vivian the front lines were acceptable, but the rear needed replacement, that he had the correct specification copper-nickel line in the van, and that he could finish it that afternoon if she wanted. She wanted. He finished at 4:30, tested everything, charged her a fair price that she recognized as a fair price because she'd looked up what fair looked like before he arrived, and left without any ceremony. She texted Ethan. "Gareth finished. Rear lines replaced. He said to tell you the rest looked cleaner than he expected." The response came back in about 10 minutes. "Good. Tires next. Call Hendricks on Route 9. Ask for the Dunlop racing equivalent. They still make the closest modern spec to the original fitment." She called Hendricks. She asked for the Dunlop equivalent. The man on the phone paused and said, "Who told you to ask for that?" And when she said Ethan Cole, the man made a sound of recognition and said he could have her sorted by Wednesday. This was, she was learning, how Ethan's world operated. Not through reputation in the conventional sense, no website, no awards, no profile in the trade publications anymore, but through a network of people who knew what he knew and trusted it without needing it explained. She'd built professional networks for 20 years and understood how they functioned, and she recognized this one as different. His wasn't built on positioning or strategic relationship management. It was built on the simple and old-fashioned fact that when Ethan Cole said something was good, it was good, and people remembered that. The tires went on Wednesday as promised. Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after his first visit, Ethan came back to do the final check. He arrived at 10 again, same truck, same toolbox, different shirt, gray this time. The cuffs frayed slightly at the right wrist in a way that suggested it was an old favorite rather than a work shirt in rotation. He came in, poured coffee, and went to the Jaguar. Vivian had been in the garage since 8. She'd told Derek she was working remotely, which was technically true. She had her laptop and had cleared her morning calendar. The honest version was that she didn't want to be anywhere else when this happened. She was tired of managing that particular admission and had stopped trying. Ethan worked through the final checklist in about an hour and a half. Brake system confirmation following Gareth's work, tire pressures, fluid levels, a check of all the systems he'd addressed over the previous 2 sessions. He worked without narrating it, which she'd stopped expecting him to do. When he found something, he'd note it. When everything was as it should be, he'd say so. At 11:45, he stepped back from the car and wiped his hands. "It's ready," he said. 2 words, plainly delivered, nothing added to make them sound like more than they were. Vivian looked at the Jaguar from across the garage. Tires new, brakes sound, engine correct, the whole car assembled and functional in a way it hadn't been in 8 years. It looked the same as it always had. That hadn't changed. But she knew now, in a way she hadn't known before, what was underneath the surface, what had been wrong and what had been corrected, and what it had required to get from one to the other. "You mean it's ready to drive?" she said. "On reasonable roads, yes. I wouldn't take it on the highway at speed until it's had a few miles to settle. The engine needs to relearn itself in a way. But around town, open secondary roads, it's ready. She nodded. She stayed where she was. He looked at her. You're not going to ask me to take it for a test drive first? No? You could. It's a reasonable precaution. I know. She came toward the car slowly. But the first person who drives it, since my father shouldn't be someone running a test. She stopped at the driver's door. It should be someone who's going somewhere. He was quiet for a moment. Where are you going? He asked. She hadn't fully decided until he asked. The answer came up immediately, clear and specific. There's a road my father used to take when he drove it, she said. About 4 miles from here. It goes up through the hill country. Not a proper road, more of a long county road. He said the car liked it because the elevation changes gave the engine something to do. She put her hand on the door handle. He used to take me when I was very young. I haven't been on it since. Ethan looked at the car and said nothing. She opened the driver's door. The hinges still had that particular resistance. Not a broken resistance, just the stiffness of a door that knew its own weight and required a specific intention to open. She'd heard it 3 times now, each time Ethan had opened it to work, and each time it had done something to her in the chest that she couldn't exactly name. She got in. The seat received her the way old seats do. Not ergonomically, not adjusting to her, but simply offering what it had always offered and leaving it to her to accommodate. The leather was cold from the garage air and then almost immediately began to warm. She put her hands on the steering wheel. Her father's steering wheel. 3 spokes. Leather worn at the 9 and 3 positions, slightly shiny from 20 years of his grip. She put her hands in those exact places because there was nowhere else to put them. She sat there for a moment. Ethan hadn't moved. My father used to say, she said, and then she stopped because her voice had done something unexpected. She waited for it to settle. He used to say that every car had one person who understood it best, not who owned it or who drove it most, but who understood it. And that car ran better for that person than for anyone else, because the understanding changed the way you listened to it, and the way you listened changed what you heard, and what you heard changed how you drove. She turned the key. The Jaguar started immediately. No hesitation, no uncertainty. It fired and settled into its idle in the space of 2 seconds, the engine finding its rhythm the way something finds a rhythm it already knows. The sound came up through the floor and the seat and the wheel and into her hands. She sat in it for a moment before she touched anything else. Ready? Ethan asked from outside the open door. She looked up at him. Come with me. He blinked. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't that. I don't need to ride along. I know it's mechanically sound, she said. I'm not asking you to come as a mechanic. She looked at him directly. I'm asking you to come because you brought this car back and you should be in it when it goes somewhere for the first time. He stood in the garage with his hand resting on the roof of the car and looked at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on him before. Not quite reluctant, not quite moved, something between the two. I have to be back by 3, he said. It's noon. We have time. He went around to the passenger side. The passenger door opened with the same resistance as the driver's, and he folded himself into the seat, which required a slight adjustment to the angle of his legs given the low-slung cabin. He pulled the door closed. The interior was suddenly shared in a way that felt different from the garage. Smaller, more immediate. The two of them enclosed in the specific smell of old leather and machinery and history. He reached down and tried to find the seat belt. It's a lap belt, she said. Period correct. Single strap across the lap. He found it and buckled it. Of course it is. My father said the lack of a shoulder belt kept him honest about how he drove. Your father and I would have gotten along. She put it in first. The clutch was heavy, heavier than she'd expected, heavier than modern cars, requiring a deliberate engagement that demanded your full attention. She let it out slowly and felt the car move forward under her, rolling through the garage toward the door, and she reached up and pressed the button for the automated door without taking her eyes off the line ahead. The door rolled up. Daylight came in. She pulled out of the garage into the Thursday afternoon and stopped for a moment in the lot, letting the engine settle at idle, feeling the difference between the car in motion and the car standing still. Everything moved differently. Everything communicated differently. The wheel had weight to it and texture, and the seat transmitted every surface texture of the lot through the suspension in a way that modern cars spent enormous engineering effort specifically to prevent. You felt everything. "Turn left out of the lot," she said, mostly to herself. "I know where Route County 14 is," Ethan said. "If that's the road you mean." She glanced at him. "You know it?" "I grew up about 6 miles from here." He was looking through the windshield at the lot exit. "I've driven that road." She didn't say anything to that. She filed it away, another piece of the strange coincidence that had produced this situation, and turned left out of the lot. The road from the garage to the county road was straightforward. 3 miles of secondary road through a modest commercial stretch that became residential and then became the beginning of the hill country the area was known for. Vivian drove at moderate pace, not because she was being timid, but because she was genuinely learning the car, learning the weight of the wheel and the depth of the clutch, and the particular relationship between throttle input and response that this engine, now corrected, now properly timed, now running all 6 cylinders cleanly, produced. It was different from anything she drove regularly. Her daily cars were modern, a performance sedan, a capable SUV for winter. She could drive them without thinking. This car required her to be present. Every input required intention, and every intention produced a response that you had to be paying attention to receive. There was nothing between her and the road, no buffer, no smoothing, no filtering. She understood, for the first time really, what her father had meant about machines that were built by people who cared. You could feel it. "How does it feel?" Ethan asked. "Like driving something alive." He nodded. He was looking at the road ahead, and his posture in the low seat was the posture of someone who was comfortable in a car, rather than someone who was a passenger in one. A slight forward lean, one hand resting on the door sill, reading the road ahead the way she suspected he always read things. "The steering will feel lighter once you're at speed," he said. "These old cars, the steering weight shifts with velocity in a way you don't get with power steering. It actually becomes more communicative the faster you go, not less." "My father said that," she said. "He said it steered better on open road than it did parking." He was right. She turned onto County 14. The road changed immediately. The surface shifted from maintained suburban tarmac to something older and slightly rougher. The kind of road that had been paved and repaved multiple times over decades and carried the history of that in its texture. Trees on both sides, not dense but present, and then the road began to climb. The Jaguar took the incline with the directness that Vivian felt through the throttle foot, the engine pulling into the rise, the 6 cylinders working together in the way they were supposed to, the way they hadn't been able to for years. She brought it up through the gears, second, third, the gearbox requiring intention at each change, the synchromige doing its work with a precision that felt mechanical rather than electronic. And by the time they reached the first long straight on the climbing section, she was in fourth, and the car was doing something that she could only describe as being happy. She knew that was not a rational description. She didn't care. "There," Ethan said quietly. The view opened on the right side of the road, the hill country falling away below, the kind of geography that didn't announce itself until you were level with it, a long, open spread of low hills and fields, and tree lines in the middle distance. The afternoon light was flat and even, the kind that made everything look like it was being seen clearly rather than dramatically, which was sometimes the more moving of the two. Vivian eased off the throttle and let the car settle to a lower pace, not stopping but moving slowly enough to take it in. She'd been here before. She'd been here as a child, sitting in this seat, the passenger seat, before she could drive, watching her father's hands on the wheel and the way his face looked when he was on this road with this car. He'd never been more at ease anywhere, not in boardrooms, not at home, not on any occasion she could remember as clearly as the memory of him on this road with his hands at 9 and 3 and his shoulders down. "He loved it up here," she said. "I can see why." Ethan was looking out at the view, unhurried. Good road, good sight lines. The elevation changes give you enough to pay attention to. He said it felt like the car could breathe up here. Ethan looked at her briefly. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." She drove on. They were quiet for a while, moving through the upper section of the county road with no particular agenda except the road itself. And it was comfortable in the way that certain silences with certain people become comfortable faster than logic suggests they should. She'd been in hundreds of important conversations in expensive places with professionally interesting people, and almost none of them had produced a quiet this easy. She thought about that while she drove. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Still asking," he said, which was what he'd said in the garage 2 days ago, and the repetition of it had the quality of something becoming a small shared language between two people. "When you worked on the car," she said, "when you were listening to it, looking at it, what were you actually doing? Not the technical part, I understand that, but the thing you said about asking what the car had been trying to tell people. What does that actually feel like from the inside?" He thought about it. Outside the window, a farmhouse passed, then a long fenced field. "It's hard to explain without sounding strange," he said. "I run a company worth several $100 million based partly on intuition about whether the people in front of me are telling the truth," she said. "Strange is a relative term." He looked at her sidelong, then he looked back at the road. "When I come to a car, I don't know," he said slowly. "I try to come to it without a conclusion. That's harder than it sounds. Every specialist who worked on this Jaguar came in with a conclusion, either a prior conclusion from another job or a conclusion produced by the software in the first 10 minutes. The conclusion shapes everything after it. You look for evidence that confirms it or contradicts it, but you're always in relationship to the conclusion." He paused. "I try to come in with just the question, what is this car specifically, and what is it trying to tell me? And how do you hear the answer? You look at everything," he said. "Not for evidence of a specific thing, just everything. The service record, because the record is the car's autobiography and the owner's autobiography simultaneously. The physical condition of every component, not to determine if it's broken, but to understand what condition it's in and how it got there. The sounds it makes, even when it's not running, because metal contracts and expands and things that are under stress or misaligned have their own signatures." He shifted slightly in the seat. "And then you add it up. Not formally. You just hold it all and wait for something to become clearer than the rest. The thing that, once you see it, makes everything else make sense." Vivian drove and thought about this. "You do that with people too, don't you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. He was quiet for a moment. "Probably." "You did it with me, when you arrived. You were reading me the same way you were reading the car." "I read everyone," he said simply, not apologetically. "It's not something I turn on and off." "What did you read?" The road curved left and she took it smoothly, the car leaning into the turn with a confidence that came from the correctly set geometry, the tires with appropriate grip, all the components doing what they were supposed to do. Someone who'd been disappointed so many times she'd built the disappointment into the expectation, he said, but who hadn't stopped, who was still there, still trying, still standing in the garage with the car uncovered. That matters. He looked at the road ahead. Also someone who'd read the service record herself, not just provided it for specialists to look at. You'd actually read it. She glanced at him. "How did you know that?" "The way you talked about it. You knew which entry I was referring to before I described it in detail. You knew the word off before I said it." She had. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table 2 days before he arrived, rereading her father's handwriting, and she'd held on that last entry for a long time. "I read it the night before you came," she said, "for the first time in probably 6 years, all the way through." "What made you do that?" She thought about it. "I don't know exactly. Maybe because it was the last time, the last specialist. I wanted to be present for it, I suppose. Not just show up and hand someone the car and stand back." He nodded. "That's why it worked." "Because I read the service record?" "Because you came in paying attention instead of waiting for someone else to pay attention for you. That changes the room." He paused. "I noticed it immediately. You were actually watching, not performing watchfulness, actually watching. When I measured the contact gap, you were tracking what I was doing, not the result, the process." He glanced at her. "Most people in your position watch for the result. They want to know if it's fixed. You wanted to know how." Vivian felt something in this that she wanted to examine later when she was alone. "My father was like that," she said. "I know. I read his log." She shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in the acknowledgement of something. You keep doing that, connecting him to things. I spent a lot of time with his handwriting, Ethan said. You get a sense of someone from how they document things. He was precise, but he cared about the car in a way you can see in the notes. He didn't just document what was done. He documented what he observed, how the car felt, what he noticed. Most logs are just dates and parts. His reads like someone having a conversation with the machine. Vivian's throat did something. She focused on the road. He did love it, she said, in a way that was slightly separate from the rest of him, if that makes sense, like it was its own category. It makes complete sense. They drove on. The road descended slightly and then leveled, and the view on both sides opened to the broader sweep of the area, the hills in the near distance, the pale afternoon sky, the whole landscape doing what landscapes in this part of the country did in the early afternoon of a good week, which was simply exist without apology. Vivian thought about a conversation she'd been avoiding since Thursday. Victor called me, she said. Ethan looked at her. Yesterday, she said. He called to say a few things. One was that he'd looked into the contact point specification for this engine and confirmed that what you'd found was, in his words, the correct diagnosis. She paused. The other thing he said was that he'd asked around about you in the professional community. He said the response was consistent. What did he want? Ethan asked. He said it neutrally, without defensiveness, genuinely asking. He said he wanted to understand how someone with your background ended up running a small garage rather than being, his phrase, at the top of the field. She kept her eyes on the road. I told him that was a question for you, not me. What did he actually want? Ethan asked again, more specifically. He wants to offer you something, she said. He's involved with a consortium that's acquiring a significant collection of vintage British and Italian vehicles. They're looking for someone to oversee the restoration program. He said it's based here, no significant travel, substantial compensation. She waited. Ethan was quiet. Outside the window, the road passed under the car steadily, the engine doing its work with the easy authority of something that had been properly corrected and was now operating inside its own competence. He told you this so you'd tell me, Ethan said. Yes. I think he thought it might carry more weight coming from me. She paused. Or possibly he felt he couldn't deliver it to you directly after Tuesday, which I understand. Ethan looked out the passenger window. What do you think? She asked. I think Victor's opinion of me went from 0 to significant in about 3 hours, and that's not a stable foundation for a professional relationship. No, she said, it's not, though in fairness, the work stands on its own. The work stands on its own in a small garage too. She nodded. She hadn't expected to push him on it, and she didn't. She'd passed the message along because it was right to, not because she had a stake in the outcome. Though she noticed, in the part of herself she tried to be honest with, that she was glad his first response was skeptical. There's something else, she said. Something I want to ask you separately from Victor's offer. All right. I want to offer you a consulting arrangement, she said, not restoration work specifically. I have several other vehicles in the collection, my father's collection, things he acquired over the years that have had varying degrees of care. I've had them maintained by a rotating selection of shops, and I've never been entirely confident in any of them. She took the car through a gentle right-hand curve, feeling the chassis respond. I'd want you to look at all of them. Tell me what's actually happening with each one. And beyond that, I have business interests that include some acquisition work in the automotive space. I'd want access to your judgment on what's worth pursuing. He didn't answer immediately. That's a significant offer, he said. It's what the situation warrants. I don't want a salary, he said. I don't want to be on retainer or on staff or anything that means someone else's schedule runs my time. I'm not offering that. I'm offering to pay you for specific work on terms we agree on a timeline that doesn't compromise your garage or your hours or being home for dinner. She glanced at him. I'm not trying to reorganize your life. I just want access to what you know. He was quiet again. She let him be. The road reached a small turnout, a wide shoulder where people pulled off to look at the view, a makeshift thing, gravel and packed earth, something worn into the landscape by repeated use. She pulled in without planning to and stopped the car and left it idling. The view from here was better than anywhere else on the road. She remembered this spot. Her father had stopped here every time. "He stopped here," she said. "I figured." She looked at it. The hills, the distance, the afternoon light going slightly warmer as the day moved through its middle hours. She was aware of the engine running beneath her, the low and steady voice of it, the sound she'd been hearing in her memory for 8 years and now had back. "My father used to turn the engine off here," she said. "He said you had to be quiet enough to hear the view." She reached down and turned the key. The engine stopped. The silence was immediate and large. Out here, away from traffic and the sounds of the commercial stretch they'd driven through, the quiet had real substance to it. Wind in the trees on the hillside. Something in the distance, maybe a hawk. The ticking of the cooling engine under the hood, a small series of contractions as the metal adjusted to stillness. They sat in the quiet car and looked at the view. After a while, Ethan said, "I'll think about what you're offering. That's all I'm asking. I mean, I'll actually think about it, not just say it." "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference." He looked at her sidelong, and this time the almost smile got all the way there. Not big, not performed, just a real expression making a brief appearance on the face of a man who didn't traffic in them casually. She turned the key. The Jaguar started again immediately, without hesitation. The engine came back up to idle and held there in the quiet of the turnout, and she sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before she put it in gear. She drove back down the hill. The descent was different from the climb. The weight of the car shifted forward, the engine in a different relationship to the transmission, and she learned new things about the car on the way down that she hadn't learned going up. She was starting to understand the language of it. Not fluently, not yet, but the beginning of a vocabulary. They were back on the secondary road approaching the commercial stretch when Ethan said, without any particular preamble, "6 years ago, I worked on a car up in Vermont. Owner was an old man, retired physicist, who'd had a 1960 Austin Healey 3000 since he bought it new. He'd driven it for 40 years, and then his license was revoked for medical reasons, and it just sat in his barn. About 5 years in the barn." She glanced at him, then back to the road. "He reached out through a friend of a friend, same way you found me. I went up and spent 4 days on the car. Fuel system was destroyed from sitting, needed complete rebuild. Ignition, same situation. The body had some barn-related damage, rust from humidity. Rodents had gotten into the interior." He paused. "His wife had died the year before. He told me on the second day while I was working. Didn't make a production of it, just mentioned it, the way you mention something that's become part of the texture of your life rather than an event in it." Vivian drove and listened. "He sat with me while I worked," Ethan said. "Every day, all day. He didn't talk constantly. He just was there. He'd tell me things about the car occasionally, trips they'd taken in it, things that had gone wrong over the years and how they'd been fixed, things his wife had said about it." He looked at the road ahead. "When I got it running, he cried. Not publicly, not dramatically. He just had tears on his face while he listened to it. And then he pulled himself together and shook my hand and said thank you." "Did he drive it again?" "No, his license was still revoked. He just wanted to hear it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He said his wife used to complain that the car was too loud, and that when it was running in the barn, it was exactly the right amount of loud, and it felt like she was complaining from the other room. Vivian kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I drove home after that," Ethan said, "and Mara was asleep because it was late, and I sat at the kitchen table for a while thinking about what it means that people hold on to things. Not because they're irrational or because they can't let go, but because the thing holds something real, something that doesn't exist anywhere else." He shifted in the seat. "Your father's log is like that. The car is like that." "Yes," Vivian said. "It is." She pulled into the garage lot and stopped the car. The engine ran on at idle, patient, present. Through the windshield, she could see the garage door, and through the side window the specific quality of the afternoon light on the gravel, and she became aware that she didn't want to turn the engine off. Not because she was afraid it wouldn't start again. She knew it would start again. Ethan had made it right. But because she was sitting in something she'd needed for 8 years, and the moment of getting up and walking away from it would mean it was ordinary, and she wasn't ready for it to be ordinary yet. She let it run. Ethan sat with her, not asking what they were waiting for, apparently understanding that they weren't waiting for anything specific. "He was right," she said. "My father. About machines carrying the people who made them." She put her hand on the wheel, the worn places under her palm, "and carrying the people who loved them." "Yes," Ethan said. She turned the engine off. In the quiet that followed, the Jaguar settled into itself. The ticking of contracting metal, the sounds of a thing that had been moving and was now still. She sat in it for another moment and then opened the door, the hinges with their familiar resistance, and got out. Ethan got out the other side. He came around the front of the car and opened the garage, and she drove it back inside, slowly, into its place against the far wall. She shut it off and got out and closed the door and stood back. The car was back where it lived, dark green under the garage lights, chrome catching a piece of the afternoon, the hood settled and latched, and the whole machine resting in its proper place. She didn't cover it. She looked at it for a long time. Behind her, she heard Ethan packing his toolbox. The small sounds of tools going back to their places, the latching of the case, the sounds of a day's work finished. She turned around. He was holding the toolbox and looking at her with an expression that was steady and direct in the way all his expressions were. Not asking for anything, just present. "I'll call you," she said. "About the arrangement, when I have it drafted properly." "All right." "And Ethan." She stopped. She wanted to say something accurate, not something polished. He spent 20 years building something, and then at the end of it he came home and drove his car on a road in the hills and turned off the engine and listened. She looked at the Jaguar. "You gave him back to me. Not forever. That's not how anything works. But in a way I wasn't expecting to have again." Ethan looked at the car. "He's in the tolerances," he said quietly. 60 years of careful hands, including his." She nodded. He went through the door. She stood in the garage alone with the car that ran again, and the light that was going golden through the window, and the weight of what the afternoon had been. Outside, the pickup started. She heard it pull out of the lot. She went to the workbench and sat on the stool and looked at the Jaguar and didn't reach for her phone or her laptop or anything else, and just stayed there for a while in the specific quiet of a room that held more than it had any visible reason to hold. Her father would have understood exactly what she was doing. That was enough. The envelope was in the trunk. Vivian found it 3 days after the drive up County 14, on a Sunday morning when she'd come to the garage alone with no particular agenda beyond being near the car. She'd been doing that, coming to sit with it, sometimes starting it and letting it run for a few minutes just to hear the engine, sometimes just sitting on the stool and reading or working or not doing anything in particular. Derek had noticed the shift in her schedule and said nothing, which was one of the things she valued most about Derek. She'd opened the trunk to check the spare, something on Ethan's list, a note that the spare should be inspected before the car went on longer trips. And she'd found the spare tire in its well, and beneath the thin mat that covered the well, she'd found an envelope. Not hidden, exactly, just sitting there. A standard white envelope, letter-sized, sealed, with her name written on the front in handwriting she recognized before she'd fully processed what she was seeing. Her father's handwriting. She stood at the back of the car with the trunk open and the envelope in both hands and just breathed for a moment. The morning was quiet. Outside the garage, she could hear the occasional sound of a car on the street. Ordinary Sunday morning sounds. The world going about itself with no awareness of what was happening in a private garage a few hundred feet off the road. She sat down on the floor. She didn't mean to sit on the garage floor in her clothes on a Sunday morning. It happened because her legs made the decision without consulting her, lowering her until she was sitting on the concrete with her back against the rear bumper of the Jaguar and the envelope in her lap. She looked at her name in his handwriting for a long time. He'd always written her name the same way, the V slightly larger than necessary, the rest following from it with the compressed precision of someone who'd learned penmanship in a generation that treated it as a skill rather than an affectation. She'd seen her name in that handwriting on birthday cards and notes left on kitchen counters, and for years in the margins of documents he'd sent for her review when she'd first joined the company. She'd stopped seeing it 8 years ago, and she hadn't fully understood until this moment how much she'd missed the specific shape of it. She opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages, written on the same ruled paper he used for the service log, the same pen. The date at the top was 11 months before he died. Not the last week's, not a goodbye written in the knowledge of immediate ending, but a letter written in what must have been an ordinary period, set aside for a specific purpose. She read it in the morning quiet of the garage. He wrote the way he documented the car, precisely, without ornament, saying exactly what he meant and not more. He explained that he'd been aware for some time that something about the car was slightly wrong. His word, the same word from the log entry, off, and that he hadn't yet been able to identify it. He wrote that he intended to figure it out, that he'd been thinking about who to bring in, that he had a few names he was considering. And then he wrote, "But if you're reading this, I didn't get there. Or I did, and the car ran fine for years and is only now giving you trouble again, in which case, I hope you found someone good, someone who actually listened to it." Vivian stopped reading for a moment. She looked at the far wall of the garage, the toolbox shelf, the coffee maker Derek had brought and she'd kept because the coffee was better, the stool with the worn seat. She went back to the letter. He wrote about the car, not its mechanical history, which was in the log, but his history with it. He'd bought it when Vivian was 9, not 11, as she'd been remembering. The date surprised her. A late summer auction, a price that had required more financial rearrangement than he'd admitted to her mother at the time. He described driving it home and stopping twice on the way because something in the experience of the car on an open road required stopping and simply sitting with it. He wrote about the early years when the company was growing fast and he was gone too much, and how he'd sometimes driven the Jaguar at 6 in the morning before the rest of the family was awake. Not to avoid them, he wrote, but because those hours alone in the car were the only time he was fully present, rather than occupied with the next thing. The car didn't allow distraction, he wrote. It required you. I needed that more often than I wanted to admit. He wrote about the car shows he'd taken Vivian to. He'd remembered the specific ones, dates and locations she'd half forgotten, names of cars they'd seen, things she'd said. He remembered things about her childhood with a specificity she hadn't known to expect, and reading it felt like being told that someone had been paying closer attention than she'd realized. You asked me once why I loved it, he wrote. I gave you an answer about craftsmanship and tolerances and the people who built it. All of that was true. But the real answer is simpler, and I was embarrassed to say it at the time, which is strange because there's nothing embarrassing about it. I loved it because it made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not somewhere I had to get to, not something I had to accomplish. Just here, driving this car in this specific moment. I have not had an abundance of those feelings in my life. The car was reliable for producing them. On the second page, he got to the thing she hadn't known was coming. He wrote that he'd left a small adjustment undone, intentionally. Somewhere in the ignition system, he'd noticed, after the timing service that had produced his off entry, that beyond the timing issue, the contact points in the distributor were sitting at a gap he wasn't certain was correct for this specific engine. He'd been researching it. He'd found reference to the factory specification range and noted that this engine, based on its serial number and build date, had been assembled by a specific team in the last weeks of a production run. And the documentation from that production period suggested the point gap on engines from that batch ran slightly tighter than the standard specification. He'd meant to have it checked properly by someone who understood the individual variants in these engines, by someone who would measure by hand rather than by computer. I didn't leave it wrong to make your life harder, he wrote. I left it the way it was because I knew whoever fixed it right would have to actually understand the car. Not just diagnose it, understand it, the way I've been trying to understand it for 20 years. And I thought, irrationally perhaps, and I'll allow that it's irrational, that the person who understood it would be someone worth knowing, someone who knew how to listen to a machine the way I've been trying to listen to this one. I don't know if that person exists. I don't know if you'll find them. I might fix it myself next spring, but if you're reading this, I didn't, and whoever fixed it did it right, and that tells me something about them. Vivian sat on the concrete floor with the letter in her hands. Outside, a car passed. Someone's dog barked once from a distance. Ordinary Sunday. She read the last page. He wrote about her, about the company, about the choices she'd made, about watching her build something from inside the thing he'd built and seeing her make it better in ways he hadn't anticipated. He wrote about being proud of her in the particular way that parents who are also professionally serious people feel pride, not just in what she'd become, but in how she'd become it, the specific shape of the way she moved through difficulty and kept going. He wrote, "The thing I tried to show you with the car, all those years, taking you to shows and explaining things you probably didn't care about at the time. I was trying to show you that the most valuable things are almost always in the details, not the obvious details. The small ones. The ones that require you to slow down and pay real attention and not be in a hurry to reach a conclusion. I don't know if it worked. You were usually watching me rather than watching the car, which I hope was not a disappointment." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He wrote, "If the car runs, take it up County 14. Stop at the wide shoulder about 2/3 of the way up. Turn the engine off and sit there for a while. There's nothing to see particularly. I just always thought it was the right kind of quiet." She sat on the floor for a long time after she finished reading. The concrete was cold, but she didn't move. She held the letter and looked at the Jaguar's rear bumper above her head and thought about the specific strangeness of receiving something from someone who was gone. Not a memory, not a story about them, but an actual thing they made and left. Words chosen carefully and sealed in an envelope and placed in a specific location because they believed, without certainty, that someday the right moment would arrive. Her father had believed that the car would run again. He'd believed it enough to write a letter to the person who would be there when it did. He hadn't known who that person would be, hadn't known exactly when, hadn't known whether he himself would still be alive. He'd left the letter the way he'd maintained the car, because the thing mattered, and because mattering required preparation, and because careful preparation was the only honest response to something you valued. She stayed on the floor until her back told her it had opinions about concrete, and then she got up. She went and sat on the stool and read the letter again, more slowly, stopping at the places she'd moved through too quickly the first time. The second read was different. Less shock, more attention. She could hear his voice in the sentences more clearly, the cadence of how he spoke, the slight formality he'd always had in writing that was different from how he talked but recognizably came from the same person. When she finished the second read, she folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She sat with it in her hands. Then she picked up her phone and called Ethan. It rang 3 times. She heard, in the background when he picked up, the sound of something small and immediate. A child's voice. A Saturday morning cartoon, the ambient sound of a house in the morning. "Hey," he said. "I found something in the car," she said. "Can you come by?" A pause. She heard him move to a different room, or at least away from the television. "Is something wrong with it mechanically?" "No, nothing mechanical." She looked at the envelope. "My father left a letter in the trunk. I found it this morning." A longer pause. "I'll be there in an hour," he said. He was there in 45 minutes. He came in without ceremony, poured himself coffee, and came and sat on the other stool across the workbench from her. She had the letter out, the 3 pages refolded and sitting beside the envelope. She'd thought, on the drive over, or whatever his morning had been, that she might not be able to get through it without her voice doing the thing it had been doing this morning. She decided to read him the relevant sections rather than summarize, because his handwriting deserved to be heard rather than paraphrased. And if her voice did what it was going to do, then it was going to do it, and she'd wait for it to pass. She read him the section about the contact points. She read slowly, and she held the pages flat, and she got through all of it. Ethan sat across from her with his coffee mug in both hands and listened. He didn't move through the reading. His eyes were on the middle distance, not on her, which was the right instinct. It gave her room. When she finished that section, she set the page down. He was quiet for a moment. He knew, Ethan said. He knew the gap was wrong. He didn't know by how much or exactly where in the specification range it should have been for this specific build. She looked at the letter. He knew that whoever fixed it right would have to measure by hand. Because the computer wouldn't catch it. Because the computer was calibrated for the standard specification and this engine ran slightly tighter. She paused. He'd researched the build records for this serial number specifically. He knew it was from a particular production batch. Ethan looked at the Jaguar. He was going to figure it out. Yes. He was close. He was very close. She smoothed the first page of the letter against the workbench. Unnecessary, just something to do with her hands. He wrote that he'd left it the way it was because he wanted whoever fixed it to truly understand the car, not just diagnose it. Ethan was quiet again. His expression was the internal one, the one she'd learned to recognize as him processing something real rather than preparing a response. He tested everyone who came, he said, without being there. Yes. 27 people over 8 years, and none of them caught it. None of them measured manually. They all ran diagnostics, and the diagnostics said within tolerance. She looked at him. You measured manually because you came in with a question rather than a conclusion. He nodded slowly. She looked at the letter on the workbench. He would have liked knowing that, she said, that the gap was what it was because of when the engine was built, the specific people who built it in that specific week. He would have liked knowing there was a reason that was that particular. The tolerances, Ethan said. The tolerances, she said. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, a bird was making a sustained and optimistic sound in the trees near the lot. The morning was doing its ordinary business. There's something else in the letter, she said. He wrote about the car, about what it meant to him. She picked up the second page. He said it made him feel like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, not somewhere he had to get to. Ethan looked at the car. That's what a good machine does, he said quietly. When it's right, when everything in it is working the way it was meant to work. He paused. You stop thinking about what you're doing, and you're just in it. He also wrote that he'd been too absent when I was young, that the car was how he made himself present, in the early mornings when he drove it alone, because it required him in a way that his work didn't always. She stopped. I didn't know he thought about that, the absence. Parents usually do, Ethan said. They just don't always know how to say it while there's still time. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the car, and his expression had something in it that was personal and unguarded in a way she'd only seen from him a few times. You think about it, she said, every day. He said it simply, not as confession, just as fact. Every day I make a calculation about what I'm choosing and what I'm not choosing. I don't always get it right. There are nights I'm distracted when I should be present. There are times I'm thinking about a car problem when Mara's telling me something I should be hearing. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. The difference between your father and most people isn't that he got it right. It's that he knew it mattered, and he kept trying. Vivian folded the second page carefully. He told me to take the car up County 14, she said. Stop at the wide shoulder and turn the engine off. You did that Thursday. I know. She looked at the Jaguar. I did it before I read the letter. Something in that landing on her again, the specific thing she'd been sitting with all morning. She'd driven the road her father loved, with the man who'd fixed the car her father loved, and stopped at the place her father always stopped, and turned the engine off in the quiet the way her father had taught her, before she'd known he'd told her to, before she'd known the letter was there. She'd done it because it had felt right, because something in the afternoon had led her to it, because that was what the moment required. Her father had prepared for a moment he couldn't predict, and she'd arrived in it from the other direction. He would have liked you, she said to Ethan, not for the first time, but with more weight now than the last time she'd said it. He looked at her. You said that before, he said. I know. I mean it more now. She picked up the envelope and slid the pages back into it. He wrote that the person who fixed the car right would be someone worth knowing. He believed that. He built the whole letter on it. Ethan didn't say anything. He received it the way he received most things. Steadily, without deflecting, without needing to do something with it immediately. The arrangement you proposed, he said after a moment. Yes. I've been thinking about it. I assumed you had. I want a few conditions that aren't negotiable, he said. Tell me. I work on my schedule. If something comes up with Mara, school, sick, anything, work stops and we rearrange. No argument, no penalty. Agreed. I give you honest assessments even when they're not what you want to hear. If a car in your father's collection is beyond reasonable restoration, I'll tell you that. I won't tell you what I think you want to hear. That's exactly what I'm paying for. And I keep the garage. he said. Whatever this arrangement is, it doesn't replace the garage. I have customers there who don't have other options. I'm not closing it. I would never ask you to. He nodded. He looked at the car again with the specific attention he always gave it. There's something I want you to understand, he said, about why I'm saying yes. All right. It's not the money. He said it without apology. The money's good, and I'm not pretending otherwise. There are things it would make easier for Mara, and I'm not going to perform indifference to that. But that's not the reason. Then what is? He was quiet for a moment, choosing the words carefully the way he chose his tools. Not the first available thing, the right one. Your father loved that car for 20 years, he said. He documented it like it mattered. He researched the factory records for its specific serial number. He noticed when something was slightly wrong and he tried to fix it, and he didn't get there. And then he left a letter in the trunk for whoever would. He looked at the Jaguar. That's someone who took something seriously, who understood that attention is a form of respect, and that the things we give our attention to carefully, they carry that. They hold it. He turned back to her. I've been working on cars for 15 years, he said. Most of them are just cars. They're property. They have a function and they serve it, or they don't. But some of them are something else. They're records. They're the evidence that someone was here and cared about something and put their care into it. And those cars deserve someone who understands the difference. He paused. Your father's collection is that kind of thing. I can tell from the one car. A man who maintained that Jaguar the way he maintained it. Everything else he touched will be the same. Vivian looked at the letter in her hands. He'd want me to take care of it, she said. He'd want it taken care of correctly, Ethan said, which isn't always the same thing. She nodded. It was the kind of distinction her father would have made, the kind she should have been making more consistently herself. All right, she said, your conditions are accepted. He extended his hand across the workbench and she shook it. His hand was the hand of someone who worked with it, the calluses, the old scars on the knuckles, the grip that was firm without performing firmness. Afterward, he sat back and finished his coffee, and they talked for a while about the practical matters. The other vehicles in the collection, how to schedule the initial assessments, what information she could gather about each car's history before he looked at them. It was a working conversation, efficient and specific, and it felt right after the morning's wait to have something concrete to organize around. At one point, his phone rang again. He checked it, said 1 second, and answered. Hey, Bug. A pause, during which Vivian could hear a small voice making some kind of case with considerable energy. Ethan listened. Yes. Okay. What kind? Another pause. The place on Meridian? Listening. Give me an hour and a half. Yeah. Tell Mrs. D you'll be ready at noon. Pause. I love you too. Okay, bye. He put the phone down. Lunch request? Vivian asked. Demanded is more accurate. He stood and picked up his mug to carry it to the small sink. She's been told the word demanded is not appropriate for food requests. She uses it anyway. Sounds like someone who catches holes in arguments. She gets it from her mother, he said, and then something in his face shifted, the smallest recalibration, and he added, and from me, honestly. I've stopped pretending otherwise. Vivian stood as well. She picked up the letter and held it for a moment. Can I ask you something personal? She said. The ratio of personal questions to professional ones in this arrangement is already high, he said. But go ahead. Her mother, she said carefully, the calls on birthdays. Does Mara ask about her? He dried the mug with a small towel and set it on the shelf, deliberate about it, buying a second. Every few months, he said, there's usually a phase. She'll ask questions for a week or two, then stop, then it comes back. He leaned against the counter. I tell her the truth in age-appropriate installments. Her mother loved her and loves her. Her mother made choices that meant she couldn't be the parent she should have been. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. He paused. Mara is 8, and she understands more than 8 should have to understand, but she's not. She's okay. She's actually okay. She has you, Vivian said. Most days that's enough. He pushed off the counter. Some days it's clearly insufficient, and she reminds me of that specifically. Vivian almost smiled. Good. Children should be able to tell you when you're failing them. She has no problem with that. He picked up his toolbox. She walked him toward the door. At the entrance to the garage, she stopped and turned back to look at the Jaguar one more time. It stood in the morning light the way it always stood, the dark green and the chrome and the long, elegant shape that had been the same since 1961, unchanged by everything that had happened to it and around it and because of it. She thought about what her father had written, that it made him feel like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not somewhere he had to get to, just here. She understood that now, not as a concept, but as a thing she'd felt in her own body, sitting in the car, on the road in the hills, with the engine off, and the quiet doing what her father had always said it did. She didn't feel it only about the car. She felt it about this morning, this garage, this particular collection of things that had come together in the past 2 weeks through a chain of events she could trace but couldn't quite explain. Her father would have found an explanation. He'd have mapped the causality, her persistence, Ethan's background, the specific nature of the problem, the letter in the trunk. He'd have found the logic in it. She found something else in it. Not logic, something that didn't have a clean name, but that she recognized from the feeling it produced. The feeling of being in the right place at the right moment, of being the right person for a thing she hadn't known she was trying to be the right person for. She thought about the 27 experts who'd missed the contact point gap. She'd spent 8 years being frustrated by them, and she understood now that the frustration had been partly misdirected. They hadn't been careless, most of them. They'd been capable people using good tools to ask the wrong question. The right question required something the tools couldn't provide, a willingness to start from nothing, to hold off the conclusion, to listen to a machine the way her father had listened to it, without an agenda. Most people couldn't do that. Most people, herself included, in plenty of contexts, came in with the answer they expected and then organized the evidence accordingly. Her father had known that. He'd built a test for it and left it in the trunk. She turned back to the door. Ethan was waiting, not impatiently, just standing there the way he stood, balanced and present. "Go have lunch with your daughter," she said. "That's the plan." "Thank her for letting me borrow you." He looked at her. "She doesn't know I've been here." "Then don't tell her yet. She'll ask questions for a week." He almost laughed. It was the closest he'd come to an actual laugh in the 2 weeks she'd known him, and it changed his face in a way she was glad to have seen. He went through the door. She stood in the entrance and watched him load the toolbox into the truck and get in and back out of the lot with the same unhurried competence with which he did everything. The pickup turned right onto the road and was gone. She went back inside. She sat on the stool with the letter in her hands one more time. 3 pages, ruled paper, her father's handwriting. She thought about what he'd written at the very end, the final paragraph she hadn't read aloud to Ethan, the one she'd held back not because it was too private, but because it was too specific to her. He'd written, "You're going to be fine. You already know that. You've known it since you were about 14, and there was nothing left I could teach you about persistence. What I want you to know, and what I may not have said with sufficient clarity while I had the chance, is that being fine is not the same as being whole. Being fine is a floor. I hope you find the ceiling too." She sat with that for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called Derek. "Clear my Monday morning," she said when he answered. "How much of it?" "All of it. I'm going to take the car out." A brief pause in which she could hear Derek processing this, updating his internal model of things. "I'll move the Harrington meeting to wherever it fits," she said. "It'll fit somewhere." "Of course." Another small pause. "The Jaguar?" "The Jaguar." "Good," he said, and she could hear in the single word that he meant it. That Derek, who had driven 2 towns over to bring better coffee and had found Gareth Poole's phone number in 40 minutes, and had brought the referral back to her desk twice when she'd said no, had been waiting for this answer for longer than any of that. "Thank you, Derek," she said, "for the coffee and the rest." "That's what I'm here for," he said simply, and she understood it wasn't just his job he was talking about. She hung up and sat in the garage for a while longer. The Jaguar waited. She thought about all the things that were only slightly wrong. The small misalignments, the gaps too small to measure by eye, the fractions of an inch that changed everything in a hand-built machine operating at the edge of its tolerances. She thought about the people who noticed them and the people who didn't, and why the difference was so rarely about intelligence or equipment or professional standing. She thought about attention, about what it meant to give something your real attention rather than your professional attention, which were different things, and she'd spent 20 years confusing them. Her father had given the car his real attention for 20 years, and had written about it the way you write about something that taught you things you didn't know how to learn elsewhere. She thought about Ethan at his kitchen table after 4 days in Vermont, listening to an old man's car run in a barn, driving home to his sleeping daughter, sitting in the quiet with the weight of what it meant that people held on to things. She thought about Mara, who corrected people's pronunciation and found school a long meeting she hadn't signed up for, and asked questions for weeks about things that mattered and didn't stop asking until she understood. She thought about her father, 11 months before the end, sitting at a table with paper and a pen, writing to a person he couldn't name, in a moment he couldn't predict, trusting that the thing he loved would outlast the gap between his care for it and the next person's. That was not small. That was one of the larger things a person could do. To maintain something carefully, to document it honestly, to leave it better than you found it and trust that the next set of hands would understand why. She stood up. She went to the car and opened the driver's door, the hinge with its familiar resistance, the specific weight of it, and got in. She put her hands on the wheel. She didn't start it. Not yet. She just sat in it in the quiet morning garage with the letter on the passenger seat and her hands on the worn places in the leather and let herself be exactly here, in this specific moment, with no particular place she had to get to. Her father had been right about the car. Some machines required you. They didn't allow distraction or partial presence. They asked for your full attention, and when you gave it, you got something back that nothing else produced. The feeling of being completely inside a moment, of being here rather than somewhere you were trying to get to. She thought you could say that about more than machines. She thought you could say it about the kinds of people who showed up in your life with a $12 tool and a question instead of an answer, who measured carefully by hand what everyone else had trusted to software, who understood that the most important things were usually in the smallest details, and who went home every night to a daughter named Mara because they'd decided that being present mattered more than being celebrated. Outside the garage, the morning was getting on with itself. The light through the side window had shifted, going from early gray to something warmer and more definite, and it reached across the floor and touched the hood of the car in the way that afternoon light had touched it when the engine first ran, the dark green paint doing what dark green paint does in good light, which is simply to be exactly what it is. She sat there for a while. Then she turned the key. The engine started. It always would now. That was the thing. That was what the 2 weeks and the gray binder and the feeler gauge and the 3 pages of her father's handwriting had produced. The certainty that the thing she'd been afraid to lose was not lost, that what he'd built and maintained and documented and loved had been heard by the right person at the right moment and was now, once again, exactly what it was always meant to be. She sat in the running car and listened. The garage filled with the sound of the engine, not loud, not dramatic, just present. The steady voice of a machine doing its work with the precision of 60 years of careful hands, including her father's, including now her own. She thought, there it is. She thought, there he is. Then she put it in gear and drove out into the morning and didn't look back.